All right. We are live on YouTube and ROKFIN. And we have Randy Olson here, who is the author of, let's show. I saw this in MedPage Today. How to Control the Information Fire Hose of the Pandemic. Government agencies need to hire a narrative officer. Now, Randy, I've told you, I'll be honest with you, when I first read this, I was thinking I'm going to jump out my window. First story window, not second story, but
into the garden.
How does this guy? And I actually have to say up front, I really appreciate your willingness to come on and talk about this, because there are a lot of people, I think, who would agree with you, who would never want to go on a channel and discuss this kind of stuff with somebody like me, who interviews censored people all the time and get very nervous about this word narrative and feel like there's too much narrative and too much lockdown on it. And so the fact that you're even willing to be here, I think we're going to have a very interesting and enlightening discussion. So thank you for doing this. Maybe we should first just start with, before we get into your article, why don't you define a few terms for us? What is a narrative and what is a narrative officer in your opinion? And then you could give us some background on who you are anyway and why we should even be bothered talking to you.
And okay, and speaking of narrative, thank you for upstaging everything I had to say with that picture of the guy losing his hair there. In the corner, alopecia, topic of the moment. You see that?
Oh yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, they must have known I did a video about Will Smith.
Exactly. And it's from Pfizer, who I work with. Okay, so yeah, and I'm not looking to get into anything massively controversial here. So let's begin. As you said, you asked to define, as I define the word narrative and narrative officer and that sort of stuff. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay. So I have a very analytical definition of the word narrative. I offer it up in my book, Houston, We Have a Narrative, published in 2015 by University of Chicago Press. In chapter 11, we really got into the depths of it. So I've been teaching workshops for a while, and my improv instructor, Brian Palermo, began to bug me saying, what's the difference between this word storytelling, and narrative? And I said, they kind of all blend together. They're all the same. Story's a narrative, narrative story. In fact, when I began talking to English professors and things like that, that's what I got back from the humanities folks. You can't pull them apart. A narrative is a story. A story is a narrative. Well, I dug deeper, and where I come at this whole thing from is from the world of Hollywood, where they've actually gotten very analytical about it, and they've spent a century working on narrative structure. And that's what this relates to, is narrative structure. And it turns out narrative structure is everything, because we have two basic modes to communicate through, which is narrative and non-narrative. Non-narrative refers to the idea of just a bunch of information without a clear problem that we're pursuing. You get this all the time with scientists. They give presentations that are totally non-narrative. They're just going, and here's a graph of this, and here's some data on this, and here's a table of this, and they've lost the narrative. They don't know what's going on. Narrative refers to the definition I offer up of it in the book. Very simple, 15 words. We repeat this in our training program over and over again. Narrative is the series of events that occur in the search for the solution to a problem. And the key words in there are the problem and solution. Everything in our brain, everything in our culture, everything in the neural system of every creature on this planet is all built around problem-solution dynamics. Every lizard that crawls out of its burrow every morning begins the day with a problem. How am I going to feed? And the brain goes to work solving that problem, finding something to feed on. So it's such a universal dynamic. And then you begin to look more closely at it, and you realize this problem-solution dynamic underpins everything and underpins logic, reason, argumentation, storytelling, the scientific method, comedy, on and on and on. It's all built at the simplest of all levels around the problem-solution dynamic. So that's where everything begins for me. And then referring to that term of a narrative officer, it's the idea of one individual within an organization who looks at all the information that's going down the pipeline and is constantly saying, what's the problem-solution dynamic here that's going on? Why do our people need to read this whole article about this thing? How does it relate to the problems that they're working on? And that doesn't go on. And a month ago, was on a panel for a science organization, and one of my friends works for that organization. And I called her up and told her, guess what? I'm doing this panel on communication for your agency. And she said, tell them we are over communicated to. That was the start of this article. And that's what I told them on the panel was, as soon as I talked to one of your people, She said, she sent me a list of 14 different updates and briefings and newsletters and everything that she's required to read. And she said, more than half of it, I get to the end of it, like, why did I have to read that? That has nothing to do with my job, the problems that I'm working on. So that's the definition that I use. It's very analytical. It's very inert, as I said in the article. And the crazy thing is that there are a number of people that, I mean, there's 14 comments on the thing. Not a single person there appears to have read it. All this stuff just blows by people. And there are a number of scientists and doctor friends of mine that I sent it to, and they just skimmed it and then began telling me everything they know about narrative. Everybody thinks they know this word narrative, but they don't really know it from that analytical perspective that Hollywood knows it from. And that's where it becomes powerful, is if you can get more analytical about it. Does that make any sense?
Okay. Where is the role of the truth when it comes to narrative?
Some of your listeners are going to hate me for this. Here we go.
I won't hate you, Randy. I may disagree with you, but like I said before we went live, you cannot offend me. So I brought you on because I hardly ever get the chance to actually talk to somebody who I likely disagree with on a lot of this stuff and just hash some of this out. And so I'm grateful for you for being here. So no hate, just love, but just tell us what is the role of the truth? What is the role of the truth?
There's a strong chance you're going to end up liking most of the stuff I say.
We'll see.
That good question, this word, the truth. And here is the most recent starting point to address that, which is 2 years ago, Rudy Giuliani, the ultimate clown, was on Meet the Press, and in a heated discussion with Chuck Todd, he said, Chuck, the truth is no longer the truth. And all Chuck Todd could think to do was to guffaw and ridicule that. And then when you looked at social media, everybody went after Giuliani. And there's plenty to go after him about, but that's not the thing to go after him about, because that's the situation. The truth is no longer the truth, because we have both ends of the spectrum feeling that they own the truth. And Stephen Colbert, began this process 12 years ago when he coined his term truthiness. That was the beginning of realizing this word truth has lost its meaning. It's all relative. The important things now are this narrative dynamic and this idea of narrative versus non-narrative. Those are the two worlds. And the real world tends to be non-narrative. We get thrown all these events that don't add up very well. And when somebody really starts to give you the sequence of events that happen in the real world, it's not a great story. You know this from being a reporter. You have to shape the narrative. And what that means is moving it from just the pure information, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, and restructuring it into the way our brain is programmed, which is this template that we're going to get into, the ABT, which is this happened, but then this happened, therefore this then happened. And that's narrative structure. So we've got two different worlds. We've got narrative structure and non-narrative. And sadly, the real world tends to be non-narrative, right?
Do you think that some of the distrust people have in the media or in the government is because they're too focused in some cases on narrative? I hear from people all the time that that there's a greater focus on framing, like Roger Ailes famously, I believe, said, let's tell the American people how to think. Isn't that narrative? And doesn't that kind of make your skin crawl a little bit?
All right. So here's something I'm going to say that's going to come off sounding arrogant and probably alienate a bunch of your listeners. But I now work with all these major organizations. I work with the training program. We've just finished 25 rounds with everybody from the National Park Service to Pfizer and Genentech and Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, on and on, all these major groups. And it's a ton of fun because they're getting it. They're understanding the power of this approach. And what the approach is built around this simple template of the ABT, the template of and, but, therefore. And this is a template that I pulled together a decade ago. I derived it from the two guys that really mastered it, which are the co-creators of South Park, Matt Stone and Trey Parker. And if your folks want to search, just search Trey Parker NYU, and you'll see a great video there of the two of them talking to a film class at NYU and explaining the basic dynamics. And they didn't come up with this. I researched it and dug all the way back to 1986, a speech from Frank Danielle, who's the greatest of screenwriting instructors at USC. I was lucky enough to have his course the year before he passed away. And in 1986, he gave a speech, and there's two paragraphs in there. And this is extremely simple, and I'm sure that you'll relate to this. What he said is that he was talking about screenwriting, but it applies to everything for communication. He said, we always begin our first drafts with the dreaded and then structure. That's the non-narrative thing. You don't have a problem identified yet. It's in the revisions that we begin to remove those and thens and replace them with either but or therefore. Every time you start to add buts and therefores, the narrative complexity gets more interesting, more compelling. And it's those buts in particular, more than anything else. That's the force of contradiction that activates the brain. And the neurophysiologists are now doing research with MRI where you can see when people listen to it, got more of those buts in it, the brain gets charged up. So this stuff is all about contradiction. People have said for ages, the media is driven by conflict. Not driven by conflict, it's driven by contradiction, which conflict is one of many different varieties of contradiction. But it's also driven by mystery and intrigue and fantasy and all those things. They're all forces of contradiction. So these are the simple elements that we work with in this training, that once you begin to speak this language, you begin to see it in the world around you. And it's this narrative, non-narrative divide that's fundamental. And so that circles back to the question about the truth. That's a subjective element.
Okay, let me go back to the article. Now they're advertising that I can find a new provider. So maybe you like that advertisement better. MedPage. Don't get me started. I'm going to leave MedPage alone for a second. Okay. So in this article, basically what this is my takeaway from it. Okay.
Sure.
Is that there was too much information coming out of the government during the COVID pandemic. And everybody just basically got confused that there was a communication failure. You referenced this guy, Dr. Eric Topol, saying that it was a historic botch job, that the science was good and the public health policy was good. It was just they weren't communicating it well. People got confused, and it gave ammo to the dissenters. In my experience doing what I do, which is interviewing the dissenters, it was the opposite of too much information. It was people who felt like the government was trying to silence everybody who was not on board with their particular view of the science or public policy. And that is what led to massive distrust, because people felt like they couldn't ask questions. They couldn't have conversations. Doctors were being targeted with their licenses because they were, we'll get into, and I should just give everybody heads up on YouTube.
Let's dive in on that right there. That's
okay,
really
but hang on. And so let me just show this. Okay. So like, for instance, somebody on YouTube is asking, of all the data, how much conflicted? So like, that was another point of contention where you had data that some data would say one thing, other data would say this, and that's kind of that should just be normal science, like arguing and working through the process and talking with each other. But it seemed like, actually not even seemed like, it was reality and still is. I mean, we can't even talk about some of this stuff on YouTube because of the narrative. That's the way I define it. Maybe I'm defining it the wrong way, but people felt like with conflicting data, with different ideas about how lockdowns or masking or vaccines or whatever, early treatment, whether you should just go home and wait till you can't breathe or you should get treatment in the hospital, what kind of treatment, listening to the pharmaceutical companies above other doctors who maybe had been in practice for a long time, all that stuff. And then, and really not even just the sort of unilateral push from the government and pharmaceutical companies themselves, but then also the active effort to silence, like we just had the Biden administration's interesting development of a disinformation governance board. That's sort of like moving in that direction. That was what I think turned a lot of people off, not what you argue in this, which is too much information. That's just my experience.
Okay. Time for me to dive in on some things.
Go for it.
Okay. It all starts with this. This is a best-selling book from the business world. See, the #1 New York Times bestseller from about 10 years ago. I've never even read the whole thing. I just know that the title is extremely important. The One Thing. The business world understands this. The science world doesn't begin to understand this fundamental divide. So this is the cultural challenge that we face. That, we didn't even get into my background, but basically I did a whole career as a scientist. I became a professor as a scientist. I left there, went to film school at USC, became a filmmaker, did that for 20 years. And then began circling back to the science world and written 8 books now on communication, everything I learned in Hollywood that's relevant to starting the science world, but really to everywhere. And I'm now, I'm 60, coming up on 67 years old. I'm at the, the end of the journey to some extent. I'm at the synthesis point, and I'm seeing some of these larger patterns of these 3 different phases of my professional life. And one of the fundamental divides that I see that's extremely simple and very, very profound, and is at the core of so much of this stuff, is the cultures of science and non-science differ drastically. When you're a scientist, you are imbued and raised, and just through osmosis soak in this fundamental principle that large data sets are sacred. Large numbers, n equals 10,000. That is such an important thing that it gets to the point where it's an aphrodisiac to you. You go to a scientific meeting, somebody's giving a talk, and when they put up the slide that says their sample size was 10,000 people that they measured this in, you feel this feeling inside of relief, like, oh God, thank goodness. And then somebody gives a talk and they put up n equals 3. I interviewed 3 people, and you get deeply upset over that. It is at that intuitive level that the science world works on these large sample sizes that drive them. Now, compare that again with this book, The One Thing. The non-science world is not driven by giant sample sizes. They don't have that analytical mind to really weigh that out. The basic default condition of the brain with this narrative stuff, with this ABT, is to seek the one story, the singular narrative, the one little thing. Look at what happened yesterday in the Senate. One woman sat down and told her one story, and it changed this whole situation, of the January 6th hearings.
Be careful. That's another topic you can't talk about on YouTube because
we're not talking about it. We're just analytically saying this is what happened.
Okay.
Yeah, it's about the one person giving that one account. It's the power of one. And This book, by the way, the One Thing, it begins with, do you remember the movie City Slickers from the 1990s with Billy Crystal and Jack Palance? So there's a great scene in there where they're out riding the horses, and Jack Palance is offering all this wisdom of life. And he says, you know what the secret of life is, to Billy Crystal? And Billy says, no. And Jack says, it's this. And Billy says, your finger? He says, no, it's the one thing. And then he says, well, what's the one thing? And he says, that's what you've got to figure out. It's the one thing that explains everything. That is the only hope for this information fire hose and this information nightmare that our society has created worldwide. And at this moment, it is utterly out of control. And the term I came up for it a year ago so proudly was the information maelstrom, except I finally searched it and found out that I didn't come up with that. That was Marshall McLuhan, shortly before his death in the late 70s, the great media visionary, coined this term. And he said in the late 70s that we're starting on this track now. We're eventually going to get to a point where we create so much information and misinformation that the two equal each other, and we end up in this maelstrom where nobody can make any sense anymore out of anything. And that's where we are now.
Okay, don't answer this question right away, but what is more dangerous? Too little information controlled by potentially nefarious special interests, or too much information that people have at least the opportunity but have the responsibility to sort out on their own? You know what? It tastes great through a fire hose is AllisonWinePromo.com. Well, if you don't want to drink your information through a fire hose, then go to AllisonWinePromo.com and drink some wine through a fire hose. It is delicious. And you get 50% off the wine itself and 50% off shipping. You can support my work. And you cannot get these wines at your grocery store. We have the Rogue Malbec, which pairs very well with today's episode. The never before imported 90-point Malbec, which comes from almost 9,000 feet. It's extreme altitude Malbec. And the Gaucho for the cowboy. No, actually, I think it's called Kumpa, which is friend. And that's what the Gauchos, the cowboys, use. So you can be my friend. Go to AllisonWinePromo.com. Support my work. If you prefer coffee, you're kind of one of those people that's thinking, I can't believe what this guy's saying. Why is Allison? No, I'm just kidding. I can't believe what Allison's saying. Most people probably. I don't worry. Don't worry, Randy. I have my favorite, what should we call them? Alice and Morrow dissenters. And they're welcome here too. And you know who you are if you're watching. But even still, you can go to twinenginecoffee.com/Allison and support my work. These are organic coffees from Nicaragua. There is a limited black edition right now. I'm a fan of the cigar #1. It's a dark roast. But if you're a tea drinker, you can also drink Katura tea. It's tea made from the coffee fruit around the coffee bean. These are also high altitude, again, USDA certified organic, small family owned company, all the jobs, everything stays there in Nicaragua. So thank you for supporting my work. Okay, so that's my question for you.
Okay, wait a second. Hang on. Can I interrupt and force you to do something?
Was that good narrative?
No. For the sake of your wine, can you give me a 1-sentence ABT using the words and, but, therefore about that product?
And, but, therefore.
There it is.
Get a great glass of wine and support my work. But if you don't like wine, you can support my work through my coffee sponsor. Therefore, keep me in business.
That's it.
Okay.
Wasn't that easy? Wasn't that easy?
Well, you know what? When I was in the news business, we had to come to the editorial meetings able to pitch our stories in 3 words. Our boss made us do that. 3 words or less. That was it.
But did anybody ever give you a simple tool of the ABT? And that's what's happening. It's propagating widely out of simplicity because it's a tool that everybody can lock onto. And it's got a fractal dimension to it. Out of simplicity, you can start to get incredible complexity. So anyway, keep going. Okay,
so this where I can agree with you is that if we're going to just say we're talking about allowing for conversation and truth. We're not talking about narrative in the sense of locking down information that veers away from what sort of I've been calling it the established narrative because I don't even really know what to call it. But anyone that's sort of outside that safe circle of conversation, if we're talking about like allowing for all of those people that are talking to have the most compelling story to what they found, like this is the best way to communicate it, I can see the value in that. If what the narrative is this is the best way to communicate only this kind of conversation or this kind of information, because you were talking about earlier before we went to my commercials that we just have this serious problem with too much information. So that was my question for you, is like, is it more dangerous to have less information that's controlled by just a few, which can be co-opted by nefarious players, or more dangerous to have lots of information that, yes, the public is responsible for sifting through, but it is less likely to, because there's more of it, be co-opted by powerful special interests?
All right. Sorry, this is going to be obnoxious. None of what you just said interests me. What's most important, what's most dangerous is people who have deep narrative intuition.
What does that mean?
Let's go back to this word narrative again. And first off, who's in control of our society of defining a word like narrative? Nobody is. So when I started film school in 1994, let me get a little ramble out here.
Okay.
In film school at USC, and it's probably still the same today, there were 2 main tracks you could go down. You could either do narrative films or you could do documentary. So narrative films basically meant fiction films with actors, you cast them and all that sort of stuff. And documentary meant, supposedly factual, exactly like you're talking about. Well, the truth is both of them, if they're going to work, need to have narrative structure. That is this and, but, therefore dynamic, the setting up. And the ABT is 3 things. It's setup, problem, solution. That's what it is, or setup, problem, and actions. And so the word narrative is this broad universal element that got misused way back when in the film world, for starters. Then you go to the medical world and there's this whole field called narrative medicine. But really, it ought to be labeled personal medicine, because what that's referring to is, let's look at somebody's family history. Oh, that's been a narrative medicine. Well, there's the same basic and, but, therefore structure to that there is to large-scale epidemiological studies of millions of people. And so all these things have been taken off in the wrong direction. And more importantly is the word narrative, as I show at the beginning of my Houston book. I did a Google Ngram for it, where you can search the use of the word. Nobody used the word narrative when I was growing up. No newscasters in the 80s, 90s used the word narrative. Walter Cronkite never talked about the narrative of the space race or the Vietnam War. It began to emerge in the 2000s. It's a byproduct of the information era, because narrative is used to refer to these larger scale organization of information. And you start to see it emerging on its own like that. And now it's all over the place, but nobody's thought it through. And that's all I can say, is that we have a clear definition of what we do. It's working. We're working with all these great groups. Slowly but surely, we're establishing that. And to talk about this thing, that when you use it in that term, really the better term would be just the common wisdom. I wish people would say that instead of the narrative. Suddenly, everybody thought that's a powerful word to use, and you start seeing it everywhere. It's just the common wisdom. Common wisdom is that this, is going this way or whatever.
Okay, what if the common wisdom is wrong?
Yeah, exactly. So now let's think about, your brain is programmed with ABT. That's it. And understanding ABT means you've got the secret pathway into people's brains. That's what Hollywood has figured out over the last century. They are the ones that got analytics.
A lot of people don't like Hollywood anymore.
That's their problem. It doesn't matter. You know, and that's a shame.
Does that mean it didn't work? I mean, did it work?
No. What happened is that Hollywood discovered this knowledge and then didn't bother to share it with society to try and improve society. They use it to make money, basically. And that's the bottom line, you know, is that Joseph Campbell came up with this monomyth template, the first really good analytical looking at storytelling. George Lucas adapted that to create Star Wars. Christopher Vogler in the early 90s wrote a internal memo at Disney, explaining to everybody there in his company, the reason Star Wars resonates around the world is because he used the principles of Joseph Campbell. That memo became so popular throughout Hollywood that he then wrote his book, The Writer's Journey, which is now, I think, in its 4th edition, and it's kind of the Bible for this stuff. So within Hollywood, there's all this knowledge, but there's no incentive for them to get out there and try and put it into the world of politics. And when you try to, as I've done for a decade now, the political people are so busy just blazing away with their non-narrative stuff just all day long, and this, and this, and this. They can't hear anything. So I've beaten my head against the wall with the world of politics. It's their own bane.
Shout out, please, everybody. Go over to ROKFIN later and watch Tittle Tattle with Bill Doris, my show that I do for subscribers over there, only on ROKFIN, Locals, and Patreon. Also, AllisonMorrow.locals.com. Just give a shout out to everybody who's there right now in the live chat. Thank you for your support over there. You can be part of my editorial board and join in editorial board meetings on Saturdays where you can frame your own narrative and let me know what you think I'm doing wrong. Okay, so let's go real fast to a couple questions since we're talking about locals anyway. I wanna show you a couple questions that. Now you said when I asked a question kind of like this, you said none of that interests me, but I'm
the rudest guest you've ever had.
No, I don't think so. I'd have to think about that. Close, but probably not. You know, I don't have a minute. No, you're not being. It's fine. I would prefer frank honesty over nicety. So don't worry about that.
You know what? 10 years ago, I was on NPR and I cut off a guest who rambled for 2 minutes, and they blacklisted me there, as far as I could tell. There were so many.
But NPR, they're just a bunch of book mice. I mean, you can't even hear them. They whisper through all their stories. You need twinenginecoffee.com/Allison to get through any NPR report. All right. So you got a lot of questions and comments. So, okay, let me go to one that I think,
somebody said they're disturbed about the article, right?
Yeah, well, because of, I think when you said that doesn't interest me, that is the main interest of a lot of people when they hear the word narrative, is this idea of framing a story at the expense of debate, speech, and frankly, truth. You know, the ability to have nuance. Like, for instance, let's
not use that word truth. That doesn't interest me.
Okay. Well, that's good, I guess, for somebody that helps. You know, I guess that maybe that's why for you, truth doesn't matter to you.
Real world accuracy is a more specific term that does interest me.
Okay, real world accuracy, sure. Okay, so I'll stick with that then. So like, if you have doctors, for instance, that feel like during the pandemic, that the real world accuracy of what they're seeing with their patients, even dating all the way back to ventilators, which is barely something you can talk about on YouTube at this point. Whether ventilators were helpful or whether they hurt people. That was very controversial at the beginning. It was something that you weren't really allowed to talk about. Then it went on to, any number of other topics for the pandemic. And you have doctors, I've talked to many of them, who felt like the narrative did not reflect the real world accuracy. And not only, maybe they would have been fine with the government having its narrative, but allowing for other people to have a narrative too. So the real problem was not necessarily that the government was pushing something on people that they felt like was not accurate, because that's what governments do. I think people are used to that. They have their own agenda depending on who's in charge. But what people started really getting resistant to during COVID was this idea that you not only have a specific narrative that is the that is the way that we need to discuss something. It's the way that we need to format public policy around. We need to, people should lose their jobs if they don't, or they shouldn't be able to go out to dinner for this or that, or all these things around this particular public health narrative. That obviously bothered a lot of people, but I think more than anything, folks got really concerned about then the secondary push to silence anybody who had real world accuracy that challenged that narrative. So that's what those people are talking about, I think, in the comment that you saw. But like this, okay, at the start of the pandemic, the best that leaders could come up with was hand washing and social distancing. At that time, I was still watching Stephen Colbert, had to stop as you had to be vaccinated just to watch it. Jon Stewart questioned at that time, how is it in the past 100 years since the Spanish flu, there have been no Nobel Prize winning medicine discovery that could help us. Okay, and then I can't really get into this because I don't know if you know what they're talking about, but it starts with an I and it sounds like smectin. So there was all this, controversy around that. And then basically, at the end, the final thing that they're saying here is that it was totally suppressed by the powers that be. The narrative crushed it. Until this truth that has been covered up is brought to light, there's no way in hell I can trust the narrative. There's so many examples like that where people feel like, there just wasn't enough nuance to the conversation.
Can we boil this down? You're losing me in a spin of a ton of information here. You're rambling through all these sorts of things. Let's boil it down to one simple kind of question that we want to talk about.
I've asked you it 3 times, and each time you said it doesn't interest you.
Yeah, that's the problem. Ask the question a 4th time.
Okay. What if the narrative does not reflect, you use the term real world accuracy. What if the narrative does not allow for real world accuracy? And remember, we're here talking about how you think there should be a narrative officer in the government. So if you have a narrative officer who is locking down information for the government that does not reflect real world accuracy, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
The first thing I know is that spewing information everywhere is a bad thing. That is a well-established fact. And a bit of my background was in 2005, I had finished film school and was making different sorts of films. And there was an article in the New Yorker called Devolution that was about this new movement that emerged. It was attacking the field of evolution science. That's what my PhD is in, evolutionary biology. And when I was a graduate student in the 80s, the creationists were this silly fringe group of nutballs that everybody laughed at. But by 2005, they had gotten very sophisticated, very organized. They'd gotten a lot of funding, and they were putting together a very well thought out campaign against the whole field of evolution science. And I began talking to my old colleagues, and they began telling me stories that were unbelievable, which is the public's not listening to us anymore. We give these talks, and they get their own creationist intelligent design was the movement. And I made a documentary called Flock of Dodos about that was on Showtime for 2 years. And that laid out the whole agenda of what they were doing, which was they began to realize, wait a second, we don't have to listen to this voice of authority of the scientists. We can get up there and provide our own version of it. And the science world just was flat-footed. They were in disbelief, and that's 15 years ago now. And I began sending emails to people at National Academy of Science, and I was on committees with the AAAS and things like that. And they just didn't listen. And they have not adapted to the changing media environment, and they've been so slow to move on it. And this panel I was on a month ago, they sent me all this from, partnered with the National Academy of Science. They sent me all these documents, and I said to them, were these written in the 1980s? Because they read the same way as what was written in the 1980s. So the science world has not caught up with communication in this new media environment that we've got. And an awful lot of those questions you're asking about are a byproduct of that just being flummoxed by how does this happen? Why won't they listen to us anymore? And they have not adapted to this. All really comes down to evolutionary dynamics, of seeing what happens when you change an environment. Species have to adapt to keep up with it. And the science world has not adapted. They haven't taken communication seriously, and they still don't as much as they should. And yes, by the way, can I get in a little side issue here that angers a lot of people, which is when the Biden administration came in, they put together 2 teams of experts to address the pandemic. The first one was the White House, or was the advisory board. The second one was White House response team. You can go to the Wikipedia pages, both of those, and look at all the credentials of all 31 members combined of those 2 teams. And what you'll see, there was only one expert who was from the communication world. There were 15 MDs. There were 6 PhDs, I think 5 MPHs. So what happened was they went with all the science experts, with all the science knowledge. And then guess what? This is what I talk about at the beginning of that article, is that Andy Slavitt, the head guy, when he was on Eric Topol's podcast, at the end of it, Eric said, how would you grade the job you guys did? And he said 2 grades. On the science side, we get an A. We got these vaccines that are incredible. But on the social science side of interacting with society, I'd give us an F. And that's exactly what happened. That's what happens when for decades you fail to understand how important this communication dynamic is.
Is it possible it's what happens when you've been controlled by special interests and your decision making is actually more damaging than what you're telling people, and what people are reacting to is the action, not necessarily the narrative? Like, let me give you an example. A buddy of mine who still works in TV news, this was, oh gosh, at least a year ago, and she was talking about certain skepticism, again, on YouTube, so related to something with COVID. Okay. And so she said, I understand people just don't know enough. I guess I could probably say it's about the vaccines, right? They're new, people just don't know enough. I get it. And I said, no, actually, the concern that people have is that they know a lot. They know a lot. In fact, in some cases, they know far more than the journalists or even some of the doctors who are coming on, at least as far as what questions they have, and they're just not allowed to ask them, and concerns about all kinds of things. And that was just something that you were like labeled and ostracized by society if you had any dissenting views on that. And I think she looked at it kind of like you. It was a narrative problem. And the people that I've just spent the last 2 years listening to would totally disagree. I mean, that it was actually the reality, not the narrative, the reality and what was happening in action that made them skeptical. This person says, why do you think the public can't handle the truth and need to be fed stories?
And it's not about stories. Let's not talk about the word stories in terms of this stuff. It's about narrative structure. It's about and, but, therefore. It's about setup, problem, solution. And that dynamic underpins everything. And what the public needs to be handed is the clarity of the moment of, here's the context, here's the singular problem as best we can see, the overarching problem that we're working on, and here's the actions that we're taking. That's narrative structure. That's not storytelling. That dynamo exists inside of stories, inside of comedy, inside of the scientific method, inside of logic, of reason, everything like that. But narrative structure is at the core of trying to address these problems, which is the understanding you've got to comply. Once again, the business world gets this, the one thing, and you've got to try and work to get these things down to what's the main problem we're addressing here.
I don't know. You're going to have to tell me, but back to that. Thank you for bringing that up. So you used the example of the woman who testified yesterday with the March 8th hearings. I call it that because I'm afraid to get flagged by YouTube. So I see an NBC reporter who also co-anchors, I think, the Today Show on the weekends, Peter Alexander. He tweets after her testimony that actually there were a couple Secret Service agents that wrote him, and they're willing to go under oath and testify that some of the stuff she said was false. So tell me, what happens to the narrative then? Like, if you're like, this is the narrative, and this one person, she changed everything, but then there are other people who go, but that's not true. What happens to what happens then, I guess? Does the one person still have to change everything? Do things change now because you have a couple of people who are challenging what she's saying? I mean, how does that affect things? Does the one thing go away?
No, she was addressing, the singular dynamic, which is the ethical behavior of the guy in charge. And so the whole dynamic there of narrative structure was pretty straightforward yesterday. And she told very powerful accounts that were filled with specifics. As you know, at the core of all this stuff, to get back to your word truth, it's perception versus reality. People figured that out quite a long ways back in the media world. This is the thing you wrestle with. And it turns out that the brain is programmed to this ABT dynamic, that all else equal, that people will listen to people that hit the ABT structure more closely than they'll listen to people who lay out the information in the and form. Those are the two models that people need to start thinking about, ABT versus and. And there were two presidential candidates in 2016 who ran against each other. I won't mention the name so you don't get dinged over that. But one of them had very deep narrative intuition. That person had come out of the world of television, had intuition of the basic ABT setup, and you can see it in the structure of the speeches that person gave. The other one was a policy wonk, and you can see it in those speeches. That other person went on and on and on, and this, and this, and this, and this, and it was boring. And that's what happens. And you cannot lead. The fundamental little couplet is that narrative is leadership. People don't follow leaders who are boring and confusing. They follow leaders who are interesting, who are able to set this stuff up in a pretty clear problem, identify it, the actions you'll go after. And that other guy who did get elected set out a lot of these things in very simple terms that the masses could, it penetrated through. They got it. Let's go build a wall. And that is simple communication, whether you agree with it or not. And in a world of too much information, it's the person who can get this stuff together in that simple structure to cut through the noise that begins to get the advantage, whether you like it or not.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think what I'm curious about more than just people being able to communicate effectively is the idea of controlling how people communicate effectively, which would be, in my opinion, I don't know, maybe I misread this, but government agencies need to hire a narrative officer. So somebody who's in charge of that communication. So which also I don't quite understand. I worked on even for the government, and we had like 12 people on our communication staff for a small agency, and still hired out public relations firms, spent just tons and tons of money on communication. So how would this be different than like a communications director, somebody like that anyway? I guess that's another question. But my I think focus is really your idea that you have an officer who's like, okay, this is inside our storytelling framework. This is outside our storytelling framework. Say you're a doctor who works in the FDA.
Stop with the storytelling. I'm not advocating storytelling whatsoever. I say it in the article down there. I say that 10 years ago, Microsoft hired Steve Clayton as their chief storytelling officer that began a trend in the business world. And that's fine in the business world. But I say in that next paragraph, the medical world is not ready for that. They don't want to talk about story, and that's good. And in my books, I talk about story phobia. The science world has a problem with story. That's not a word that you want to throw around because it does bring all this extra baggage. Narrative is the dynamo, the force inside of a story, but narrative is the inert stuff. I use that word inert in several of my
you do use the word storytelling in this article.
Yes.
And you've already brought it up a couple times in our conversation. So that's why I started using it.
Yes, but in that context, and I say that, the medical world's not ready for the word story and storytelling. Okay.
Well, okay. What word would you prefer that I use on my podcast?
Narrative
structure. Okay. So I want to communicate effectively with you, so I'm going to use your terminology. So if I'm the person who is in charge of the narrative structure, and I'm at the FDA, and the doctor comes up to me and says, "This narrative is not really true," but I'm the narrative officer. Now I'm the person in charge. What do I do at that point?
Why would you use the word this narrative? Let's say this version or something of this topic or something. You're saying
true again. Say that again.
Yeah, you use the word true again. This version's not true, you said.
Accurate. I'm sorry, you have so many requirements for words that I'm supposed to use. You must be a narrative officer.
Yeah, that's what I am in my spare time. Exactly. See, we're in this world of so much information that if you don't start trying to lock down a few of these things analytically, then you're just propagating more and more information and not getting anywhere. That's why these big organizations are enjoying this training. They're finding it as a means to find the simple core thing of what you're trying to get across. What's the main problem and what's the actions that are being taken?
I need you to repeat that.
That what this is about is trying to simplify things down into these three fundamental elements, which, by the way, were first uncovered and talked about in the 1600s by the great philosophers, Kant and Hegel and all those guys, back when people could think more clearly. This is the core problem of today of our society. Everybody's impaired. Every single person in society is impaired because we have too much information. 100 years ago.
Wait, hang on. Because of too little information, we were throwing women into water to see if they floated. Yes. We were burning people at the stake. And if you veered away from that, there was no recourse to find other information. And you were just at the mercy of the narrative officer. Now we have a lot of information, but it's highly unlikely that YouTube could kick me off, but I don't see myself getting thrown into a lake anytime soon to see if I float. Yes. And that's because I can effectively argue against them, given the fact I can find more information.
Hang on. All right. So you're pulling out that anecdote from the distant past, but I'll match that with all the disinformation going on now. There's your equal and opposite forces.
Yeah, but okay. I'm so glad we got to this point. Okay. And my question is, that was why I asked you, 20 minutes ago, what is more dangerous? having only a few sources of information that can be easily co-opted by nefarious special interests, or having lots of information, too much information that the public does have to parse out, but is unlikely to be entirely controlled by a few special interests, I guess. I don't know another way to say it. You know, a few powerful people, I guess. When in history has that ever gone wrong?
When in history have we ever had a perfect system? So, you know, all you can do is
I would prefer a lot more, because even though there's problems with both systems, I would prefer to have too much information, which is unlikely to be controlled by, you know, like when you're talking about how things were just so great back in the 1500s.
I did not say that. What are you?
You did. You said it. People were just, I can't remember what the word was.
I said people were able to think more clearly back then.
Think more clearly. Yeah, but they were able to think more clearly about whatever they were told. I mean, people couldn't even read back then. They couldn't read the Bible.
Yes, lots of other things.
So yeah, you had priests, you had this priestly class, and I guess what I see you arguing for is a sort of resurrection of the priestly class in the narrative.
Not by any stretch of the imagination.
But you said people have too much information.
Okay. Can I tell you what I'm saying here?
Only if you use the words that I like.
Word battles. Okay.
Go ahead. I'll make you big so you have the full show.
Wonderful. 1975, there was an article published in the Journal of New England Medicine, and it was a short article titled Medical Obfuscation, Structure, and Function. The author took 3 articles out of that journal, which is one of the top 4 medical journals in the world, and went through them, put together a list of the top 10 characteristics of the writing style in this medical journal that results in obfuscation, communication that's far less efficient than it really ought to be. In the discussion of that beautifully written short article, the author said, 100 years ago, it wasn't like this. Scientists and doctors communicated with far more clarity, and just they had a clear way of a style of writing. It is only in the latter half of the 20th century that obfuscation became accepted as a mode of communication, particularly in the academic world. That paper came out in 1975. The author of that paper left the biomedical world. He was a postdoc at the Salk Institute when he wrote it. It was the last thing he did in the science world, and he went on to write Jurassic Park and Westworld, Direct Westward, and all these movies. It was Michael Crichton, the great mogul of Hollywood, who dominated Hollywood like no other individual. By 1994, he was the first person ever to have the triple play of the #1 book, movie, and TV show with the ER. And he offered up for 25 years all this knowledge to the science world of how to communicate. He was the very best guy ever to know both the science world and the media world, which is endlessly challenging and elusive. And the science world didn't listen to anything from him. And after 25 years, he eventually drifted to the other side and eventually became a climate skeptic. In 2007, I traded about 50 emails with him when I was doing a short film on climate. And he gave up on the science world. That's the path that we've been down, is that this world of science is so conservative. By definition, they have to be, because you can't have science just grabbing onto every crazy idea that comes along. It's got to be carefully scrutinized and reviewed as you build this edifice. But there's a price to be paid, which is you can't buy into some of this more innovative and novel stuff that comes along. And sadly, I wrote an article 2 years ago in NCIA titled The Lost Opportunity that was that story about Michael Crichton, this great, great mind that could have helped the science world so well in understanding how to communicate to the masses. And they ended up alienating him. And he died in 2008, a very bitter man. In those emails he traded with me, he said, I got to warn you in the first email, I may be the most cynical person on this entire planet. So that's a lot of the history that's relevant to what's gone on before the pandemic with the historic botch job, is the science world failed to understand the power and importance of communication, and failed to understand the need to come down off of this big pedestal down to the level of the average folks and get out there and figure out how to connect with them to get them to understand and buy into the science that's coming out, as opposed to what happened, which was exactly this thing you're pointing to, which is what I saw with the evolution problem in 2006, was the scientists up in their pedestal trying to make these pronouncements to the public. This is how it all works, and don't you dare question us. And I had long conversations with them. That's not going to work in today's world. So any of that make sense?
I can see your perspective. Yeah. I'll let you have that last. I'm not going to push back on that one. I do have questions about it, but I'm going to go back to locals. Okay. I asked this question a couple times already, but I'm going to ask it in this person's words, since maybe they won't be as offensive. Okay. Do you worry that narratives provide space for and will be abused by untoward corporate and political agendas under the guise of helping, simplifying, etc.?
Yikes. Do you worry that narratives, again, everybody's using the word narratives, provide space for and will be used by untoward corporate.
You were using the word narrative officer. That's why everybody's using it.
Yes. And this is good.
You blame people for using the word.
No, and this is really good because this is what happened. The 14 comments you can see on there. Everybody assumed that they already know what a narrative officer is. It's a person who stands up there and tells stories to the public. No. If you start to study this ABT structure, you begin to realize narrative structure is the simple setup problem solution dynamic that underpins everything. And there's a lot of power to be had from that. And by the way, for all your listeners, if you've got your own company or something like that, and you're involved in trying to promote it and talk about it, do this for yourself. This simple exercise, come up with your 1-sentence ABT. This is not hype. And in fact, my buddy Park Howell, the host of the Business Story podcast, is one of the 20 people that runs the training with us. And
Park Howell's in the chat here. He says, you can use narrative for good and bad.
There you go.
Thank you. That's a very honest answer, Park Howell.
Yes. Well, that's what I said back to that Rudy Giuliani quote. He said the truth is no longer the truth. You can use this narrative stuff in either direction you want. And you've got the two ends of the spectrum, both feeling that they own the truth.
Okay, but if you have a narrative officer, isn't that person basically like a centralized fire hose that says, you're kind of in or out? Like,
no, it's as I explained,
problematic.
I explained in the article there, it's the individual who's in charge of using this structure to determine what to share with people that's really relevant to the mission that we're working on and what to not share with them. That's off the narrative. That's just a bunch of other stuff like that. And you have to make these decisions. I mean, this is the world of science has had an identity crisis from day one over this. When you write a scientific paper, you can't put everything in there. The science world has evolved over the last 400 years. In the beginning, all science papers were just disgorgement of and all this stuff. And by the 1800s, they began to realize, wait a second, nobody can read this stuff. We've got to have a structure. That's what evolved eventually 100 years ago, was they came up with this 4-part structure: introduction, methods, results, and discussion, which is just this ABT structure. And you've got to structure things if you want people to be able to follow them along. If you just spew information everywhere, it's like what the improv actors like to say, which is if everything is special, nothing is special. That's what they teach in this acting. If everything you look at, oh, that's amazing. Oh, that's amazing. That's amazing. After a while, nothing's amazing. You've got to work judiciously and pick these priorities out. And in so doing, you then run the risk of people coming on and say, well, I don't agree with that priority. This goes on in the science world from the very beginning. You give talks where you've got to make these subjective decisions. Scientists are only human.
How much weight do you put on truth and transparency versus paternalism?
We're back to truth. That's just a giant complicated.
Randy doesn't care about the truth. He already said it.
I care about narrative structure and real world accuracy. Those are the precise terms to try and work on this. Again, Colbert started the trend there with truthiness. That was him ridiculing that something's gone on here. That was a byproduct. Everybody's got to understand we've been on this journey of the information explosion. It wasn't this way in the 1970s and 80s. It began in the 80s with information going wild, and now nobody's in charge and can make sense of it.
Who cares? Why is that so bad?
Because 1 million people died in the pandemic, and probably a third of them.
A lot of people died because of the narrative that didn't allow doctors to do what they felt like was best. The real world accuracy, as it was not included in the official, whatever word, fill in the blank you want to use, but the real world accuracy of what they felt like their license could be ripped if they treated their patients early. They hospitals weren't allowing it. So there were a lot of people who died. I mean, in fact, a lot of the doctors that I hear from say that was one of the most egregious consequences of the pandemic, was because of the lockdown on information, and also this sort of witch hunt of doctors that were veering away from the public health policies as perpetuated by Dr. Fauci et al., that lots of people died unnecessarily.
So science is deeply flawed. There's no doubt about that. It's done by humans. There's no denying that. So therefore,
wouldn't you want more information, not less? If it's flawed, wouldn't you want more, not less?
Hang on. I will tell you, for starters, that science is still your best hope, warts and all. Now, do you want to argue something else is a better hope than the world of science?
Yeah, I mean, well, ultimately, like, I guess theologically speaking, yes, I have a higher hope than than Dr. Fauci and the scientists. But as far as real world, yeah, I don't know. Define science for me. What's science?
It's the process. You know, it's
Okay, I can't tell you then if it's my highest hope if you can't tell me what it is.
well, it's hard to define that, but science is the natural world. It's making sense of the natural world. I think that's probably the best way.
No, I don't think my highest hope is in that.
Um,
But
well,
but I'm just that, but I appreciate
then you are
learning
pointing
about
back
it.
to the dark ages. You're pointing back to the dark ages at that point. If you're going to dismiss all this knowledge that we've accumulated that gives you all these wonderful things in your life, including your wine and your coffee that you're so enthusiastic about, I guarantee you there are lots
Yeah,
of
but it's
scientists
not my highest
involved
hope. I mean, you just
with
said it's
that.
deeply flawed. I would never put my highest hope in something that's deeply
Everything
flawed.
is we're humans. Everything in the human genome
Right. So I
programs.
just don't put any hope in it. I take the information and then, and I check it against other information. And if it's like like I'm looking at my garden right now at the window, and if science has told me over time that, peas like a little bit of shade, then I take the advice, but I'm not going to, it's not my highest hope. It's
Yeah,
just like, I'm just going to see if it works. I'm just going to see if it
what is
works.
your highest hope? You're going to go out there and develop your own vaccines?
Huh?
What if not science? What is your highest hope? You keep saying science is not my highest hope, and then where are
Well,
you going to?
I mean, yeah, but you can't even define science. How could I tell you
I
what
saw it's
if it's my
making
highest
sense.
hope?
It's making sense of the natural world. If you want a simple, broad definition, it's going out, looking at the natural world, and trying to figure out how it all works.
Yeah, no, I mean, I appreciate the information that comes from it, and I will learn from it and make decisions based on it, but I don't hope in it. I mean, hope to me, let me look up the definition of hope since we're going to get really semantic about this. Okay, hang on. What is the definition?
Definition of hope.
I'm looking it up. A feeling of expectation and desire for a certain thing to happen, a feeling of trust. No, because that says to me that, I got to like go with it wherever it goes, and I like expect it to do great things for me. Whereas it fails sometimes, like it's just a realistic.
Wait, you hit the
I
key
look at
word
it
sometimes.
realistically, like anything.
Hang on, you hit the key word sometimes. Everything fails sometimes.
Okay. And, okay, so I put them all on equal plane. I'm not gonna. I'm not. I mean, like I don't. I'm trying to think of a better analogy, but no, I look at it like it's information. It's information that sometimes gets things right and sometimes gets things wrong. And in getting things wrong, it can eventually get things right, and that's just part of the process. To hope I
Does
don't know.
this make you
That to me is a
does this-
theological term in a lot of ways. I just wouldn't put hope in humans because
Do
humans are
these two
fallible.
words make you uncomfortable?
What?
You can
What
see
two
it
words?
on this hat.
Vaccines work. Does that make me uncomfortable? No.
Okay. There you go. That's science.
I don't agree with just vaccines work. I don't agree with that. I don't even know what that means. Like all vaccines for everybody. What are you talking? And also you got to be really careful because we're still on YouTube. I mean, if you want to talk about that specifically, we can go to another platform, but I'm not uncomfortable by ideas, but that's because I don't hope in science. I think when you hope in a human being or you put your expectations or some like higher meaning in them, then you do need to, you do feel uncomfortable when they go in the opposite direction. And then you're sort of left with this infantile trust that, you have somebody like Fauci going on television saying that not trusting science or criticizing science or him, sorry, is criticizing science. That to me is a direct result of having too much hope in whatever that idea of science is, that you can't detach from it because you're too emotionally wrapped up
I don't know what else
ideologically and
to say on
emotionally.
that. You hit the key word sometimes. Sometimes science fails, but all else equal, it's your best shot at trying to solve these problems.
Okay, but what? Okay, let's go to another question because we're almost out of time.
Keeps going.
If the problem is different statements from government officials, then we might not have sufficient evidence yet to come to a scientific consensus. So how should a narrative officer decide what to tell the public? If the problem is the reaction of the public that comes up with conspiracy theories due to the mixed messages, isn't that a sign that schools should teach critical thinking and how to do good research on our own?
Once again, if you read that article in detail, you see I laid it out there what I mean by the term narrative officer. It's a single individual that enforces this criteria of setup, problem, solution, so that you're not spewing information everywhere and adding to the problem of too much information that's all over the place. It's about focus, and it's about trying to get a clear signal coming out. And when here's one little, so, unfortunately, I'm deeply critical of the biomedical establishment as trying to help them. And when Biden came into office, what was the first thing they did? They began these daily press conferences. And what they have on the screen, they had 3 people on there. They had the person from NIH, person from CDC, and the person from the White House. And once again, what would the business world have told them? One thing: we just want one spokesperson that can tell us, here's the latest thoughts that we've got. And they don't even have the instincts to know you don't put 3 people up there. Instantly, people are looking at which of these 3 is the one I should listen to. And then it turned out they began to contradict each other. CDC began to come out things that contradicted what the White House was saying. That was written up in the New York Times, Washington Post, everywhere. That's in the article. I cite those things. So these are the fundamental blunders that were made in failing to grasp the simple dynamics of communication. And my advice at the big scale for all those folks is look to the entertainment community and the business community. They are so much more adept at communication in today's society, and the science world is behind that. So much of this pain and suffering that arose from bad communication is because they haven't kept up with the times.
I think what you've said that has helped me understand what you're talking about more than anything is that that truth does not matter to you. Because I think you're right. If you threw that out the window, then having a narrative officer, I could see how we got there.
Yeah.
Because I think I don't know. I guess we're probably arguing, or not even arguing, but the questions are coming from a perspective of looking at this as if what we're trying to get to is some semblance of what you would call real world accuracy, which you say you do care about.
Yes.
As opposed to truth. Okay.
Yes.
So maybe could you define then what is real world accuracy as opposed to truth?
Real world accuracy is what, for example, the scientists see with the data. We're seeing a pattern emerging here and there and trying to get that out to everybody without it. And the problem is everything has to go through this faulty filter of our brains that are ABT programmed. That's the problem. Our deep instinct is ABT. We are set up for this setup, problem, solution dynamic. And the real world gives us this information in this and form that isn't an instant story. You know what it's like as a journalist. You're constantly shaping the narrative structure. People call it shaping the narrative, but it's shaping the narrative structure. There are age-old stories about this. If the legend doesn't fit the man, print the legend. It goes all the way back to those movies. Back in the 50s, they understood this dynamic. It's all this stuff in the media world. Media is very elusive. And Michael Crichton, in his last big speech to the science world, trying to offer up advice, said verbatim, scientists don't understand media.
Okay. Brett Weinstein and Heather Hang, among others, could tell you that science needs to include multiple information streams, hypotheses, and perspectives. And then we also have another super chat. Thank you, everybody, for the super chats and tips wherever you are. Also, and for the comments. If you say these, which we know we're talking about, vaccines work, you have to be able to objectively prove that. Okay. I guess... I don't disagree with the idea of effective communication. I get that. I think back to the article, what we were talking about is the idea of an officer. Again, how is that different from the communication director?
Because it's maybe you could add to the label narrative structure officer.
Okay. And that would be
who's really clued in on this basic narrative structure. And that it's about this problem solution dynamic. And it's not about spinning things. And it's not about spewing everything that comes down the pike. Those are the 2 ends of the spectrum. One is extreme ABT, where we've got this whole agenda. And the other is just pure and. Let's just give everything to everybody and let them sort it out. And when you do that, that's when things run amok, because the people that have got the ABT brain know how to start gathering things together and shaping it into their own structure that goes off in whatever direction. So everybody's stuck with this. one of our simple little rules in our training, we call it Shirley's Law, which is if you don't tell your own version, somebody else will tell it for you, and you probably won't like how they tell it.
Okay. Can you take a couple more questions from locals, or do you need to go?
No, I love talking about this stuff.
Okay. Wait, hang on. Here it is. By creating a narrative, I lost trust. Legitimate questions were ignored. Facts I had been taught in nursing schools denied. Why, in the age of communication, was a narrative used?
I mean, this is so fascinating that this word narrative, as I have thought all along, has just spun people off in a lot of different directions. And that's mostly what we're working towards, is to try and focus in on narrative structure. But therefore, the setup, problem, and solution. Let's get things down to the simple core structure so we can make sense out of so much of this information.
Mm-hmm. I think, well, probably because going back to, again, if it was just the government was all over the place with its information was the title, maybe that would have been interpreted differently. But it says government agencies need to hire a narrative officer. And maybe you're not in the world of people who are concerned about the lockdown of speech right now. And so that wasn't on your radar. But that's that phrase, like disinformation governance board and community guidelines,
I totally agree.
All that stuff. That's what people hear. Like, we're not going to be able to have debate. We're not going to be able to have questions. If you're a doctor who works at one of these government agencies and you bring conflicting information, you're going to be ostracized. You can't. So that's how people interpret it.
Can I answer that?
Absolutely.
I had this tiny little hope and expectation with this article, which is that the person would actually go on to read the article.
I've read it. I can understand why they are skeptical of it.
It's all laid out clearly in there.
Huh?
It's all laid out clearly in there. It's about TMI, too much information. And the only antidote to that is this narrative structure, these three parts of setup, problem, and solution, the ABT that we've been developing for a decade now and are now training people widely in. And it's very effective to try and make sense in a world of too much information, because who else is addressing this too much information problem? And nobody talks about the downside of that.
You're assuming that too much information is a bad thing. I mean, we start from totally separate premises in that regard. I prefer too much information. I think I'm part of the group of people who was turned off by a lack of transparency and information, not too much information, frankly, from the government. And like when you talk about scientists communicating better a century ago, well, maybe if the idea is clearly communicating one perspective. But, I mean, you just think about all the casualties of that. People who were locked up in insane asylums, Galileo, for, books burned, you're in prison because. So I'm still trying to figure out where we're missing each other, because I feel like maybe we just still are on that. But that's where I think people, there's kind of two camps out there. Folks who think we have an information problem, and others who appreciate that actually as a repair and a solution to past problems of not having enough information and having severe consequences, whether it's with pharmaceuticals, military conflict, whatever else, because we weren't able to access information, and that actually this is a correction of sorts, that there's risk to it, but there was also risk the old way. And you seem to think it was better the old way because it was just clearer, but there were also casualties of that.
I'm not advocating any sort of old way. What I am advocating is, like every once in a while you'll come across in one of these comment sections, people going back and forth, and someone will say, I'd like to think that people could keep two thoughts in their brain. Well, they can't. That's what this book is about. The one thing, the average people.
Did you write that book?
No, and I'm not plugging or anything like that. And I don't think it's a very good read. Like I said, it's just that title. It's this one thing. That is the fundamental dynamic, the singular narrative. You want to know something? I watched this movie last weekend from 1951 called Ace in the Hole with Kirk Douglas. He's a journalist that ends up getting to cover the story of a guy stuck in a cave. And he ends up with this kid reporter with him, and he's giving him a little lecture. And the kid says, wow, this is as dramatic as 280 people stuck in a cave. And Kirk Douglas in 1951 explains to him, no, it's not. Human interest is about the one thing. This is how our brains are programmed. We know this. This is why the story of a guy stuck in a cave will dominate the news for days on end. You know that as a journalist. That's what's going on there. The brain is not perfectly structured. We're not these machines that we can get into mountains of information, sift through it, and make up our own minds and figure these sorts of things out. We need some help when it comes to a lot of information, and there needs to be leadership. That's what you need your leaders to doing the best they can to sort through this information and then presenting it in a clear way where we can follow what they're talking about, as opposed to just obfuscating and throwing out mountains of information. That's as much as we're saying with all of this stuff.
Okay. Let's see if there's any other questions you wanna answer over here.
Truth, justice, and the American way.
Okay. From Matt, if something does not advance the narrative, reduce it or take it out. That's a direct quote from the article.
Yep.
I feel like this is already being done by big tech platforms. Whoever is telling them what to censor is already filling the job of narrative officer. I still can't talk about election integrity on these platforms. I'm just so tired of the lies.
All right. I'm not talking about politics. I'm not talking about any of that sort of stuff. That's a separate thing. Exactly as my buddy Park Howell said there. Narrative can be used for good or bad. All that I'm talking about is this inert dynamic of setup, problem, solution. And so many people involved in this stuff don't grasp that. And they think that the way to communicate is just throw every single thing out there, because at some point you're undermining the whole process and people walk away locking onto single details.
Okay. Great. Okay. So glad you said that. So yeah. All right. So you just, all this stuff goes out there. So you have to have somebody that's like, no, this is in, this is out, this is in, is out. Okay. So who is that person? How do you vet that person and maintain the integrity of that person's ability to do their job to reflect the real world accuracy and not to reflect any number of other purposes?
You do the best that you can to get a person with a conscience and ethics and things like that.
Okay.
There's no other answer than that. Everything is subjective. This is the problem. Okay. In the science world, let me tell you one little anecdote there. In the early 60s, a Nobel laureate, P.B. Medawar from the UK, wrote his final essay. It was called, the scientific paper is a fraud. So there you go. Early 60s, an essay titled that, the scientific paper is a fraud. And what he meant by that is that as a scientist, you go out for any study. If you're studying starfish like I did, you go out and measure a whole bunch of things about starfish, but you don't get to report all that stuff. There's an editor at the journal that's going to force you to make all these subjective decisions. And what gets published eventually is a fraud, because it's not everything you know. And I've been at scientific talks where the speaker is up there presenting all these data, and somebody in the audience in the Q&A says, did you bother to measure this thing? And the person says, oh yeah, we measured that. And the whole audience said, why didn't you tell us about that? That changes your whole story, And that's exactly the human side of science. It's done by human beings. They are flawed, but just because they're flawed doesn't mean you want to throw the whole institution out. That's the challenge.
Well, I guess that's kind of where you and I go back and forth on this idea of having more centralized influence, control, whatever you want to call it. I mean, I guess control is different than influence, but a centralized officer, somebody who's making those determinations because we have too much information, versus just allowing for, all the information to be out there, because you have to be less concerned about that person's integrity when there are checks and balances on their ability to do their job, versus if you centralize control or influence of the I don't even know what word I'm supposed to be using with you now, the narrative structure. If you centralize control of that, you have more risk, with that particular person. Whereas if you have many, and you have many opportunities, and more checks and balances on it, then you have less risk when it comes to that being co-opted, I guess, for another purpose other than accuracy.
Okay.
That's all. That's why I had like a manager, and I had to go sit in meetings, and I had to talk to all my friends, and I had to do all those things. And, if I had, I did have a manager once who did have particular prickly topics. It was like, no one's allowed to say this, and they can't come on and talk about that. That's because that person's at the top. That's problematic. And, if there were other people in the newsroom that could, push back on that. There were other voices, I guess. So, you didn't end up necessarily always, though in that particular case, I think you did end up with, unfortunately, an inaccurate view of a particular issue. That's all. I think that's where people get kind of is the centralization of that.
At the core of what I'm talking about is the divide between substance versus style. And there's a great book called The Economics of Attention, written in the early 2000s, that talks about that they could see this coming, that when you crank up the amount of information, there's going to be a shift from substance to style. And what that means is people can no longer go through all the substance of everything. They start listening to the style of voices that they trust, and they get drawn to that. And a major part of that is the ability to put this stuff together in a sense that's efficient and people can listen and follow. And people don't follow voices that are confusing or boring. They are drawn to voices that are interesting. And again, we've seen this in some major politicians who have had voices that they know how to structure this stuff really well because they come out of the media world where they've got the intuition. This is what's going on with Zelensky right now with Ukraine. You know, he has come out of the TV world and he's done a great job of communicating to the whole planet what's going on, whether you like it or not. And let's not get into that, but there's no denying. And by the way, that guy that was president that we don't want to mention, his opponents by the
you can say his name. You're allowed to say Trump. You can say that.
Well, by the third year into his administration, even his opponents were conceding this guy is really good with communication. Like him or not, he has deep narrative intuition. He understands how media society works. The very things that if you ever read Neil Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, and so many other scholars that came before that wrote broad popular things warning of what's going to happen if you get an information-driven society, a media-driven society. It's going to go off the rails in these ways.
An information-driven society is going to go off the rails. Is that what you just said?
They warned of it. Exactly.
Who's they?
Well, Neil Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death in the mid-'80s, great book. And he said, watch out for a society that's so overrun by media and entertainment, people will start having a hard time thinking critically. That's exactly what's gone on.
I think there are a lot of other things you could blame for that, though I will completely concede that media is a huge problem. That said, you know, I think there are like lots of problems that preceded us in previous centuries that came from the public's inability to hold their sort of narrative officers, if you will, accountable because they didn't have access to the information. So I think it's a double-edged sword. I think you could, depending on your own proclivities, you could see it one way. You know, you would want to take the risk one way or the other. And maybe it's a personality thing more than anything. Okay. Narrative officer equals disinformation officer. I don't think that's what you mean, but I'll let you respond to that. Whose narrative? Fauci, CDC, NIH. I have zero trust for them. Zip. Now, let me just fill in one quick blank here. Like I was saying before, I think in your perspective, and I hear this a lot, like I've watched a couple of your videos with other people about, you know, the anti-thises and the people who just won't get on board with the game here. And and you're like, well, it's because the government did a bad job communicating. And actually, I mean, I agree with you. They did a bad job communicating, but I think, like I said, this is just somebody who's literally been in this particular world of the skeptic for 2 years now and just listened, you know, to the nuances of all the different perspectives, some very extreme and some not necessarily, some a lot closer to the center. But I would say what aligns all of them is not that there was too much information, but actually quite the opposite. Again, like I've brought up, that there was too much focus on it has to be this way. The whole like trust the science slogan and, you know, everything like that went along with it. That was what really turned people off. And that it wasn't reflecting that the story they were constantly being told actually didn't include enough information. It didn't include enough nuance. It didn't include enough perspectives. And that's what turned the skeptics away. Not what you're saying, which was we needed to have less confusing information. I just had never heard that from anybody. That
we need less confusing information.
Yeah, I've never heard that from the people that you would be saying.
Now.
Huh?
You've heard it from me now.
Yeah, but you're already in the club. You know what I mean? You're not. You just showed me a red hat that says vaccines work.
Hang on. What club? I'm not in any club. I quit the club. Let's get clear on that. I had tenure as a professor, and I made a conscious decision at age 38. I knew when I left the ivory tower, I would pay a huge price for it, and I have. I have been ostracized, ignored, stomped on, shoved out of things.
Why?
Because the ivory tower is exactly what you're railing about. There are major elements of that. There is a closed-mindedness to this sort of stuff. Things are siloed, all those sorts of problems of today. Doesn't mean you want to throw all those institutions away. It means you want to work critically and try and help work against that stuff to improve the system. And that's all that I've done for all these years. But in doing it, I've had to pay the price of being outside those clubs. Exactly.
Okay.
So don't talk to me about clubs.
Okay, so you get it that well, what I meant by that was you're not, you say the science in the article, I believe you say this the science gets an A, but the narrative gets an F.
That's what Andy Slavitt, at the head of the whole Biden effort, gave it.
Okay, right.
Grades. Yes.
So, okay, do you agree with that statement?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
So that's what I mean. What I mean by the club is you're in the club of people who believe that the White House should get an A.
No. How are you going to argue with the A that they came up with these incredible vaccines in record time? Are you going to argue with that?
Yeah, I'm gonna argue with a lot of that stuff.
Well, then there's not much to talk about if you argue with that part.
Okay.
I mean, there's no denying that they just in record time came up with these vaccines that have worked. There's all kinds of shortcomings and things like that that are inevitable, but I think the whole world agrees that the vaccines did come along and they did reduce the rate of the pandemic.
No, the whole world, I can assure you, just go through some of my videos. All I do is ask people questions. I'm not a doctor, but I can just assure you that there's a lot of debate about that, and scientifically, not just like random people.
Even Donald Trump raved about the vaccines.
I know, and a lot of people feel very betrayed by him that now there were mandates and his warp speed and all this stuff.
He would wear this hat. Vaccines work.
Well, hey, Donald Trump, former President Donald Trump, if you come on my channel, then you can respond to Randy. So this is my invitation to please come on my channel and talk about it. Okay, so you would agree that the science, you already said, yes, I agree that you would give an A. And right? Okay. So, and
I'm not,
so like I was saying,
yeah. By the way, a lot of those guys really dislike me, so I'm not in their clubs at all. My first book was called "Don't Be Such a Scientist," and it was a critique of the science establishment. And there are people that hate me for that book. So there you go. I'm not in anybody's club.
Well, no, okay. So the reason I bring this up is just because I wanted to ask you, if the people that you're talking about who, like, again, the whole point of your narrative officer and like ABT is to effectively communicate to people who are not getting it, right? They're not getting it. So you're trying to effectively communicate the narrative structure. Okay. So if that's what you think the information is the problem. What I'm telling you is that the people, again, I'm just saying this is just somebody who's listened to people. Okay. I honestly, like, when it comes to all of this, I have my own personal opinions, but I'm trying to communicate to you what I hear from the people you're talking about as the ones who were casualties of this TMI problem. Okay. The people that don't agree with this statement because it's a TMI problem. And actually there's a lot of science out there that they've read, that they've talked about. There are a lot of doctors and scientists I've had on my podcast who don't think the White House should get an A on the science. And that is what that's what they are turned off by. And then on top of it, they're not allowed to discuss it. That if you discuss those questions or you dissent from this idea that the White House should get an A, so it's both a public policy issue and it's a communication problem. But I never hear from people that it's just like, I just felt like their information around it was lacking. It was like that actually they didn't give enough information about the problems, the drawbacks, the vulnerabilities, all of the stuff. It was just like, again, we talked about fair and balanced before all you heard was safe and effective, safe and effective, safe and effective. You can't keep your job. It's safe and effective. You can't go out to eat. It's safe and effective. And people just called BS on that.
I mean, it's easy to call BS against that. That's been one of the revelations of the last 20 to 30 years. That's what was going on with the issue I involved with initially with the attacks on the evolution world. Was people began to wake up with the internet and realize, oh my goodness, all these big institutions, we can call bullshit on them. All we have to do is, give one little speech or something and then pull our people together. We don't really have to put together evidence, that sort of stuff. We can just say we doubt all this sort of stuff. That's what has emerged as doubt casting. And that's really been a major part of the dynamic.
So you're saying if people question safe and effective unilaterally, that they're just doubt casting? There's not science to back that up?
You know what? None of that is what I'm engaged in. And let's get back to this article again. What this article is about is the idea that a group of doctors come together and they've got some huge amount of knowledge that they've gathered from large scale studies that they want to share with the public. And instead of just sending every piece of information out there of what they've gotten, they need a single individual who really understands this ABT dynamic and says, let's agree, this is going to be our context. This is our single overarching problem. And now let's structure how we're going to present this to the public in a way that will make sense. Let's not have multiple people all contradicting each other. It's about trying to get the voice into something that the public can follow. They can understand the context. They can see what the main thing we're working on is, what the actions have been done. So it's a very, as I say, it's a very inert tool that I'm talking about there. And again, but it's so good that Park jumped in there with that one statement about narrative can be used for good or bad. And it's working on both sides. You know, the people attacking are doing the same thing. And if they're good at it, they do a good job of using the same structure. They know how to set up their context and their contradiction and their consequence.
Okay. I had another question on the tip of my tongue here, but I've since lost it. I'm going to scroll back through locals and see if okay, here's another one.
Sure.
I hope I can say all this. I'm not sure I can read all this on YouTube. Government is completely untrustworthy. When would renowned published ICU doctors are silenced? When world-renowned published ICU doctors are silenced when they have found drugs and treatments that can save the lives of COVID patients, why should we trust the government that is preventing the access to those treatments?
This goes back to that very opening principle that I talked about. The idea of the one anecdote. Yep. Okay. Keep going.
Go ahead.
It's this narrative imbalance that the one anecdote is so much more powerful than mountains of data. We know this. We know this from time immemorial. It's the idea that the death of one person is a tragedy. The death of a million is a statistic. People get wound up over that tragedy of one person, that one anecdote. And those anecdotes are incredibly powerful and they can be used to undermine all of this knowledge. So this is the dynamic that the people that, you know, our leaders need to understand how that works. And it's not as simple as just throwing everything out there and thinking that sheer volume is going to explain to everybody what's going on. I mean, if you're anti-leadership, then this discussion's no point in even having, really. Are you anti-leadership? Do you really feel that we should just be a consortium that nobody leads?
No, but I also am anti. I mean, I want that leader. No, I'm not anti-leadership. But I do think I get concerned about the government having more and more power over the information that people can see.
Okay, so
I don't know if I call that leadership.
All right, this is the frustration, the struggle, this whole conversation we're having, which is that I'm not interested in weighing in on all the political dimensions that you're trying to pull this into. I'm interested in leadership, and I believe that we do need leaders. And then I'm interested in trying to help them deal with this information world and know that the brain is programmed with this narrative structure and that you've got to yield to that. You've got to understand that people need a context. They need identification of the core problem and then laying out clearly the activities. And rambling all over the place just confuses them and bores them. And as soon as you bore and confuse the audience, you've lost them. And again, we saw it with that 2016 presidential election. That one guy really had that ability to lay out the context, identify the singular problem and the simple actions that were going to be taken, whether you like it or not. And he pulled off the victory and he eventually got his whole party behind them. That's what was behind him, deep narrative intuition understanding. And I find it sad when I look at these folks in these institutions and they have just been kept in there and kind of coddled and they don't understand how that works in the real world.
Right. But I think you do put a lot of focus on Trump's ability to work a crowd, but you haven't talked much about how unpopular Clinton's policies were. and I think people don't trust her, that, you know, there were a lot of people, I have a lot of people on the left and the right who follow me, and unilaterally, they don't like her. And a lot of them don't like Trump either. So, and feel like, yeah, he gets a lot of like hero worship that he doesn't deserve. But there was a lot of stuff that, secrecy and public policy and international conflict and all kinds of stuff that she's been involved in that people just, they just, there's a lot of just distrust and dislike about her actual work, her work history, not just that, she just didn't say things right. People just didn't like her work history. They didn't trust her as a human being.
Okay, can I jump in on that for a bit here, which is that I've been through this journey from the heavily cerebral world of being a professor and academic into the deeply visceral world of Hollywood, where I spent 20 years, basically took acting classes and got some understanding of that. And that's the fundamental divide, is between the cerebral versus the visceral. And all the experts are heavily cerebral, but the mass audience is largely visceral. And Trump had this ability to connect with that. And from the outset, it's not just his ability to work a crowd. From day one, he came out with a hat that had a simple slogan, and that slogan was pure ABT, which was, "We are a great and mighty nation. We were, but we've slipped in the world. Therefore, it's time to make America great again." And that was something that people could instantly understand, rally behind. It was aspirational. It was a goal to work towards. And his opponent had nothing like that. It was well documented. She had no narrative, no clear message, narrative in the form of message, no ABT, what she was doing, other than, we're going to do a whole laundry list of all these things. And that's exactly the demonstration there, is at some point when everything's special, nothing's special. Nobody could quite grasp onto what exactly it was that, she was reaching inside of people with. And again, there's all these informational people that go at it with all the policy points and things like that. But there's this broader dimension that works of this and but therefore dynamic. And he got it. People coming out of the media world get that. They develop an intuition for it. And policy wonks don't get that. They think that every piece of information is special and that everybody wants to know it all.
Do you think of Allison as entertainment?
Of course, especially when she segues into her commercials. Is this going to be a segue into another?
I don't know what that was about.
No, that was a great question. You're definitely entertaining. That's why I'm here. You and I talked on the phone a couple of days ago, and after the phone call, all right, I'll do that. Thanks. Yes, and especially I loved your segment with Ms. Fair and Balanced, and you guys talking about USA Today. That was awesome. That was really, really good. The newspaper that's run by mostly high school interns, as one reporter told me there.
That's basically how most TV stations are now too. I mean, I basically, when I was hired by Fox News Channel out of college, I started as an intern I just graduated from college and I was hired on as an intern. I was doing the same job as all of the producers. And then they hired me as a producer. At 21 years old. So I didn't know what I was doing. I mean, it took me a year to go, wait a second. I think this isn't for me.
I used to watch the headlines on USA Today's site. They would revise them on a minute by minute basis, and they would put up headlines that were completely diametrically wrong. Mm-hmm. The Democratic Party does not want to do this. And an hour later you look, oh wait, it's changed to the Democratic Party does. Somebody did a mistake and put the not in there.
Yeah. Well, no, the fact that you like the fair and balanced conversation makes me appreciate that we can find common ground. Because I thought you would hate that, because that was all about just ripping a lot of this curtain back. But so I feel like maybe we just need to keep working on our communication.
Well, we're different. We're similar pathways in different disciplines, because this has been I've battled with the science world. As I say, my first book, Don't Be Such a Scientist, was trying to get them to understand some of these dynamics, that there's consequences if you don't communicate effectively. And the book was very popular. It went into a second printing in 2018. It got great reviews in Science and Nature. But there are an awful lot of scientists that want nothing other than praise. And that's a huge problem. And when you start to speak to them bluntly, as I do, because I got tenure, I did the whole thing. I have the PhD. I can talk to them one-on-one. I got the NSF grants, and I can say, I don't agree with you. And it turns out some of them hate that. They really are up on a high pedestal. And that's the way it goes.
Okay. So this question came in: does leadership require suppression of opposition? We were talking about needing leaders.
It shouldn't, it really shouldn't. It should be worked on so hard to bring the leadership voice down to a level that the public can connect with. And here's the key thing about this ABT, these three forces: agreement, contradiction, and consequence. It needs to begin with agreement. And that's the starting point. And that's what so many of these organizations don't get. They're out there just screaming and yelling instead of that.
Your buddy is back saying, I believe the best way to think of the ABT is not about content, but form. How do you quickly and clearly make your point, especially with complicated messages? Yeah. I mean, what I'm getting from you, Randy, is that, you know, I've already said it a million times. Like, you work for both sides or any side. I mean, it seems like, anyway, it seems like you'll help people become more effective communicators. You're not really worried about, well, you said it already. Truth isn't, whoops, hang on. Oh. My computer is hooked up to my phone.
That the wine company phone?
I don't know who. Somebody from New York is calling me. Who hates me in New York? Why are you calling me? But I think really, I don't know. I mean, maybe it was an interpretation problem. Maybe it's a communication problem. But it goes back to this idea of the officer, which I think if you're aware of what people are talking about in these other circles, like you're trying to say, hey, if you want to effectively communicate, here's how to do it. Well, because you want people to basically do what you say through that effective communication. You want to elicit a response of some kind, a desired response. And so this is why you would have an effective narrative structure. But when people that you're trying to reach, I think you specifically, but the people you're talking to are trying to reach, when they hear the term narrative officer, they freak out. So I don't think that was an effective term. Because all people hear is that this guy wants a rebirth of the Disinformation Governance Board, and he wants to start getting the CIA to spy on people who veer away from the narrative. That's what people hear that's what that term kind of means to people nowadays.
Once again, if you quit right there and didn't read the article, then you might walk away with that. But you kind of hope that people actually will read something and try and get a little bit of understanding. Let me clarify one thing you said there. That's super crystal clear. I don't work for either side. I believe in the government of the United States, and I work to the best of my ability with all these government agencies, and especially with the scientists. And that's the end of that story.
Okay. Okay. One other quick thing before we go. So I have to be careful. I think we're going to just finish this all on YouTube. So I'm just going to be very careful about how I say this. And maybe you'll say, I don't care about that either, but let's talk about if you had a narrative officer, right? So you have the person that's like trying to frame, this is the effective communication about the vaccines versus natural immunity, which is a topic you can't really discuss that on YouTube. So I could say that, but I can't really go into the debate. Or I saw you on somebody else's podcast, which I also can't play. I don't think, even though I think it's on YouTube, where you're talking about people taking horse medicine. Okay. Let's talk about that specifically, for instance. So that narrative of the idea that, and maybe you didn't mean it this way, but that particular drug is only a horse medicine, or did you mean people were relegated?
Wait, I've never talked about horse medicine. Where did you get that?
I'll find the video. I'll pull it up here.
Wow.
Hang on. Let
Sure
me, here. Okay, we're going to just watch this commercial real fast. Here. This is you, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I don't know if I got to find the exact, give me a second, because I got to find it was around maybe 33 minutes here.
Interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Here, I'm keeping the sound off. We're just gonna.
Okay. Yeah. The text maybe. So I did.
Right.
What did I say?
Yeah. Okay. I feel like this could take a second because we're trying to get to, because you're like, you say now you have people taking horse medicine. Oh, here it is. Okay.
Oh, there's that word.
Yeah. So this was a real problem because the media was constantly hounding this as a horse medicine. I have horses and I've given it to my horses, but it's a people drug. And if you wanted to debate the efficacy of it, I think that was fair, but to just always call it a horse drug, that was not true. But that's something, you can't even talk about. So the narrative, I guess, what do we want to call it? The media's story about this was constantly like going after people. And that, for this, and doctors were being targeted, and the AMA was talking about it, and hospitals were saying, we're going to be watching if you're prescribing and all this stuff. So then that created a cult of fear among doctors who were then prescribing off-label, or pharmacies that were not filling prescriptions. Do you think that was a casualty of the narrative? Like the idea of people then going into the feed store was a casualty of how the narrative broke down to disallow for doctors to treat their patients the way they felt that it was best, or pharmacies then were not filling prescriptions, and it just created, it was a mess out there. And so, but I didn't hear you talk about that. And that felt like a direct consequence of a lockdown of information because of a curating of a narrative that the media kept pushing, which was, this is just for, animals, and doctors shouldn't be prescribing it and all that stuff.
So what's the question?
The question is, was that a casualty of the very narrative that you would be advocating for, that it then ends up in real world consequences of, like you say here, people taking a horse medicine? Was that a direct result of a narrative gone awry, where you had control over it as a particular, that this thing was maligned, and so then that created all these consequences for doctors and pharmacies that then led to the consequence of people going to feed stores? So that's an example of a narrative going awry, and having like centralized control over a particular narrative that's only allowed to function in one direction, and the real world consequences of that, instead of allowing for there to be like real nuances to that. There's this very uniform structure about that particular drug, which then led to the consequences you're discussing. Like, now we're just in a world of crazy people who go to the feed store. Well, was that actually in fact a result of a curated narrative like you talk about, but that was inaccurate? Does that make sense?
Not totally, but what I will sort of point back to is what I'd said about what happened in 2005 with the Evolution movie that I made. And for the first time ever, I started talking to my old science colleagues, and they, for the first time ever, were saying, we're seeing something new here. We've never had the public push back on us and doubt what we're saying. And that's a different era. I don't know,
Is that okay?
Well, you're not 66 years old, are you? So you don't know the era that I came from. No, so I came from an era where there really was a great deal of respect for this authority. And then over time, it began to erode. And then again,
whose fault was that?
What's that?
Whose fault was that?
A lot of it's the science world's fault. That's exactly what I try and point out. And they don't like to hear that. So that's the irony, is we're sitting here and you're challenging me on stuff, and I'm an outsider with that sort of stuff. Look at all the things that I've written. My movie, Flock of Dodos, you can still get it on iTunes or whatever. It was an essay that I created that posed the question of who's the bigger flock of dodos, these creationists and all their idiotic things they were saying, or these scientists who can't communicate their way out of a paper bag and feel that everybody should listen to everything they say, even though they don't know how to come down to the level of the public. And I didn't offer up an answer there. And that angered a lot of scientists. There was a big screening at the Smithsonian they had scheduled that all the scientists rose up and got it canceled because they said, this does not paint a flattering portrait of the science profession. Exactly. That's what I was challenging them in 2006. Somebody needs to be critical of you guys because you're way up there on your pedestal at times. That's a lot of the dynamic you're talking about. And that's a human element that they've exacerbated things with by going to the public with that sort of air of superiority. This is the truth. And there's that word. And so that's a lot of what I've tried to work on is, look, the communication environment of our society has changed drastically. And you've got to work on that and figure out how you're going to modify your communications, and they haven't. And so many of the things they're still doing the same old way and just putting their fingers in their ears. And one of the things that I've spent a bunch of time with recently was the book that came out from RFK Jr. in November, a complete assault on Anthony Fauci, #1 on Amazon. And I traded emails with friends at NIH asking them, are you guys going to do a rebuttal to this or anything? And the answer was no, that'll go away on its own. And then in January, Washington Post had an article about the big rally against vaccines. And they said, this isn't a fringe thing anymore. This is tens of millions of people here across the country that are not buying into the vaccines. That's where they botched their whole communications effort. Really bad.
Well, is it communication, or is it the policy itself? I mean, I think what people were really there were a lot of people protesting that they should be forced they should be forced into a particular medical treatment without being able to take personal cost benefit analysis into account. That's what a lot of people, and they felt like they were just fed the safe and effective line, which was, slowly we have these stories coming out that it's just not true. That it isn't for everybody, and that people should be able to have a choice about it. And it was being shoved down their throats. That's what I heard a lot of people protesting about anyway.
Well, you're not going to like to hear this little perspective, and this is just anecdotes. But I had a number.
I don't dislike or like anything. I don't care. You can say whatever you want, Randy. Don't feel like you're.
All right. Well, I had a number.
Everything up that way. Don't worry.
Okay. I had a number of friends. I grew up in Kansas. A lot of my old buddies I'm still close with back there, and they're conservative Republicans and all sorts of different. I have a wide range of friends with political orientations, and several of them were anti-vax when they started coming out with them in a big way, and sent me emails ranting about this sort of stuff. And more than one of them got forced to do the vaccine. One friend in particular, his siblings said, "You cannot visit our elderly mother unless you get the vaccine." They ganged up on him. He wrote me, furious emails. He got the vaccine, and by about 6 to 8 months later, he was writing me emails about complaining about going to, a party or something and finding out somebody there wasn't vaccinated. I watch people change a little bit like that in their mindset. So a lot of this was educating the public and trying to bring people around to vaccines work and that kind of stuff. And that communication stuff was really botched. You can't sit up there on the big pedestal and talk down to the public and say, you must follow what we have to say. I agree with you totally on that. It is right for the public to wonder about this sort of stuff and expect a little bit more kind of just concern and sensitivity in the communications. That didn't happen as a strategy. And again, I point back to that one little simple number, 1 out of 31. When you look at what the Biden administration did, they assembled 31 experts. Only one was a communications person. All the rest were doctors, and they don't understand media. Great people, they understand medicine real well, but not so much media. You need these experts in these different fields. And when you don't have them, things tend to go haywire.
Okay, there's a lot I would push back on, but I'm not going to for the sake of my channel, which has already been suspended 3 times. But I'll let you have the final word, Randy. Anything that you'd like to make sure people hear. I will show your website so that everybody can see it. And they want to check you out. It's abtframework.com.
Yeah, I'm not here promoting anything. I was just here to have a fun conversation with you.
No, and I think we succeeded at that. But I always want to make sure people want to find out more about what you're doing. I mean, that's an opportunity to do that.
Here's the one thing I will say is what you got there on the screen for all you folks. I'm telling you, this ABT template is incredibly powerful. Experiment with it on a daily basis and start to use it. It's just basically about how to present your argument, and it's what's at the core of branding. This is why Park Howell, with the Business of Story, he co-authored the book that we did for the business world on that, and that's getting really popular. This is all that branding is. There's all these companies do this and this, and they do a great job. But the one thing that and again, this book, the one thing that they've never really given to you is this. Therefore, our company does this. What's the ABT of your whole podcast? There's lots of podcasts out there, but what's the one thing that you do that's different? You promote coffee.
I talk to crazy people like you, Randy.
There you go. Exactly. Therefore, people should tune in.
Therefore, I've been suspended multiple times, and I'm shadow banned on YouTube right now. Yeah,
busted.
It's worked out really well for me, this whole ABT. Well, that's my problem. My problem is not narrative; it's the actual reality of my channel. That's why I'm trying to tell you. Okay, well, yes, Randy Olson, thanks again. I do truly appreciate your willingness to come on. I know it's not necessarily like the friendliest of environments when it comes to the comments and whatnot, but I think a lot of people would have been either too snobby or closed-minded or scared or whatever to even engage. So I think it says a lot about you that you're willing to even come on and talk about it. So I do appreciate it.
Well, I think it says a lot about you. You were willing to get on the phone the other day when you sent me that email, and that, I began to like, who's this person? And since we talked, you're great. And again, would you please ask what's her name? Safe, no, not safe and effective, but
fair and balanced.
Fair and balanced. Yeah. Please ask her if she'll watch this episode. I think she was awesome. So there you go.
I will. Cool. Okay. All right. Thanks everybody for watching. I really hope we don't get kicked off of YouTube. I'll see you next time.